Children and people of God, may the name of the Lord be praised. We give glory to Jesus Christ. Today we're going to be looking into the last component of how to identify spiritually matured, growing yet grown Christians and wholesomely spiritual Christians. Now, this discussion has been running over three series. And today, obviously, at the fall of the discussion, we are looking into the last component. I want to begin by saying that thank you so much to all of those who have joined us in this three-part discussion as they look into the concerning subject of exactly how it is that we can be able to determine that people are grown yet growing in the faith, and to see that people are wholesome. And we turn the searchlight upon ourselves to say that how to determine that I myself am growing in the faith, and to see whether or not I am matured. So in today's discussion, we are then looking into the last component, and that would be attitude. Now, attitude is a very interesting component or element to look into. It's an interesting one in that attitude is one of, I would say, in fact, one which is the most revealing of an individual, because Jesus Christ says that as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. So we are defined by our thoughts, and not only our thoughts, but we are defined by the position from which our thoughts emanate. The origins of our thought are one of the most, if not the most, revealing things about us as people. Now, the question of attitude, you remember that each of the components had questions that followed them. There was a question for character, there was a question for conduct, and there was a question quite recently for knowledge. And attitude's question is, how do I think? So it's not just what do I think, but how do I think what I think? And this question looks into the origins of thought. Where do thoughts emanate from? Do I think from the world? Do I think from emotions? Do I think from the flesh? Do I think from the spirit of the mind, which is a fallen state, a lapsed state of the mind? Or do I think from the spirit of the mind of Christ? So do I think from a Christ-centric position of thought? And these are really critical questions to ask. Now, Herbert Spencer is accredited as a psychologist who is accredited with the idea that he is the first one, or the first person to have ever used the term attitude. And this was in 1862. Now, it's important that we note this for this reason. The first English translation was actually published by Sir John Wycliffe in 1332. And then after him, because obviously he was killed, burnt at the stake, I think along with his proponents, and charged under the order of the Pope with heresy and other indictments. That's a different discussion. So all of his work, all of his copies of the Bible that were first transcribed were burnt. And then after him was William Tyndale, who then transcribed the KJV that was published officially in 1611. And that's why most of us would be most familiar with the KJV version or translation. And even in the KJV version of the Bible, we do not see the term attitude, for the obvious reason, because of the fact that when the Bible in the English translation, that is through the King James version of William Tyndale, that was in 1611. At that time, the term attitude had never been used before. So the latest versions of the Bible or translations of the Bible would then have the appearance of this term. The HSBC, the Message Bible, and others as well would have the appearance of this word, because they would have been adjusted diachronically. And when we talk about diachronic studies, we're talking in linguistics about the evolution of language. So the term dia in the Greek means through, and chronology, obviously time. So diachronic adjustment means the adjustment of language or linguistics through time. So some Bibles have a diachronic adjustment of the terms. But the Bible really does have a very clear implicit use of this term, or appearance of this term, attitude. And as I'm saying, it is tacitly implied in the Bible, in that we see in Ephesians chapter 4:23, Paul the Apostle, as he writes to the Ephesians, he says that be ye transformed in the spirit of your mind, meaning that the transformation has to happen from a place of ethos. The term spirit in the Greek is also translated as ethos. Now, ethos is the spirit of the person, the composition, the essential composition, the essence of the person is seen in their spirit. So the essence of the mind, the spirit of the mind is what he's talking about. That be ye transformed in the spirit of your mind is the character of your mind. Right? So that is where we see the tacit implication of the term attitude. And also in Romans, as Paul again writes to the Romans in the 12th chapter and the 2nd verse, that be ye transformed in the renewal of your mind. So we can understand this term to be implied in the scriptures. And so it's really, really important that as a Christian, if we are to try to evaluate people, if we are to try to gauge even ourselves as to whether or not we are grown and matured in the spirit, that we look at the place from which we think, where our thoughts originate, the spirit behind our thoughts. Because some people will think from emotions, some people think from the flesh, some people think from the world. That's what informs the character of their thoughts. And that is why it's really very possible for long-standing Christians to be unspiritual, as much as it is very possible for a long-standing professor of the faith to be immature, because of the fact that there would be questions, doubts, right, and a spurious, I would say, approach to the ways in which they think. So it's really, really important that we look into the spirit of the mind. Now, what does attitude mean according to Herbert Spencer? Attitude in psychology means that it is a learned tendency to evaluate things in a certain way. They say that this can include evaluations of people, issues, subjects or objects, events, and all of those things. And so they say such evaluations are often positive or negative, but they can also be uncertain at times. So how we really evaluate things, the outlook of an individual is, as I've mentioned, one of the most revealing things about the level of a person's spiritual growth and maturity. How do we think is a very deep question. How do we think? Now, as we recapitulate our discussion from the very first part up until to the last one, the third part, the first question or the first component was character, and the question that followed character was the cardinal attributes. That is to say that who is the person? What is their cardinal attribute? Who are they? And then the second component, along with its question, the second component was conduct. What its component was, or what its question rather was, is what do they do? What is the fruit of the individual whom we are observing and trying to determine whether or not they are spiritually matured. And the third one was knowledge. What do they know, and how much do they know of what they know? And the last one, as I've mentioned earlier on in today's discussion, was attitude, or is attitude. And this speaks to the manner of thought. How do we think? I'd like to close off with this paraphrased quote over here by Charles C. Ryrie. He says, the evidence that Holy Spirit is in control of a life is not found in manifestations of the Spirit, but in the display of Christ. Because the Holy Spirit seeks to wrought and to design or promote in all of us, in all believers, Christ and the newfound life in the Spirit. And may the name of the Lord be praised.